Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Royal Blue Podcast. I'm Phil Kirkbride, and today joined by Gav Buckland and Dave Prentice as we reflect on a different decade. We are going back to the 90s after the success and the popularity of our two-part 80s pod with Dave and Gav. Fans and listeners were asking for us to go into a different decade, and suggestions came in for the 90s, and we have picked that up. And today is the first of two pods on the 90s, and very much in the same fashion as looking at the 80s one, where we look at the sides that before the success and the sides after the success. And of course, in the 90s, the one and only success was, of course, the FA Cup victory in 95. So today we go from the 1st of January 1990 up until the appointment of Joe Royle, because obviously we know what came after that. But as we started the first of the 80s pods, chaps, pop quiz. 1st of January, Luton at home, 2-1 victory, but where did it put us in the league?
You know what? I have absolutely no recollection of that game whatsoever. Whether that was because it was a New Year's Day hangover or something, I don't know. Normally I remember New Year's Day games, but that one, not in the slightest. I would guess tail end of Collins' regime, put us 8th or 9th.
Yeah, I was going to say that. Dad had poured on, I think, before Christmas, after being top of the table. So I'm with Prano. I'll go with 8.
Correct. Bang on the money, yes.
You see, that's why you have us on these podcasts, Phil. You know what I mean?
Useless trivia. That's why you're both here, yeah.
Yeah. or just useless.
Yeah. So let's rewind back a little. We're starting this pod on the 1st of January, of course. But what was the situation? You know, just as a quick reminder, we finished that 80s pod. Colin Harvey was still in charge. Going into the new decade, what was his position? What was his position, and what was the shape of the team as we went into the 90s?
I'll leave Prano from the start.
Go on. Yeah, I think his position was solid. I don't think anybody had, any concerns about his job security at that time. But clearly, the squad itself was in need of a significant makeover. I think, as we said last time, a lot of the players who'd been so influential in the 80s were beginning to get a little bit long in the tooth. Some of them had been affected by injury. Adrian Heath obviously had that, awful knee injury, and I would suggest was never quite the same again after that. So recruitment was needed. And I was looking back at some of the players that, Colin had bought in his final, sort of full close season. And it was mixed. I mean, Mike Milligan was one of the guys that came in the summer of 1990 for like £1 million, which was like a decent sum of money at the time from Oldham. And he just wasn't anything like the quality of the players that, he was replacing. And then Andy Hinchcliffe came in. Andy Hinchcliffe proved to be a very, very good signing. Unfortunately, I don't think he was ever Howard Kendall's cup of tea. And obviously, we know Howard came a little bit later after that. So, yeah, squad was in need of major, sort of enhancements. And it was mixed success, I think, so in that, summer of 1990, certainly.
Because, Gav, for maybe younger listeners who didn't live through the 80s teams, but are familiar with the names, they looked at the Everton squad at the beginning of the 90s, they would still see names of players who had had a lot of huge success at the football club.
Yeah, absolutely. But as Prano says, that was the problem in some respects. You had players. I mean, Kevin had been a great defender, but Kevin done his hamstring at Sheffield Wednesday in '88 in one of those Marathon Cup games. I think the first one. And it was quite clear when he came back, he'd lost that little bit of pace. I mean, he was probably close to 30 himself. Graham was close to 30. And Martin Keown come in, hadn't he? I think maybe it's a little bit of a replacement for Kevin. And Martin was a good player, I thought. He was a good man marker. And that only added to this. We spoke about that click thing, didn't we, in the last podcast? That was added at the end of the 80s. And those type of moves, when you've got senior players being replaced, but they're still at the club, and that's always going to add a little bit of an edge. And obviously, Martin, fine player as he turned out to be at Arsenal. That only added to that sort of dressing room disquiet. And obviously, we had the infamous Chinese restaurant incident, which Prano probably better place to talk about than me. And I think there were players there, Phil, but they needed replacing. And, and Kevin Sheedy was still there. I'm not sure whether Kevin's and Colin's relationship was that brilliant at that time. So, yeah, looking back, you think, there's some big names there, but actually big names that have been there for a decade or more. And that was the problem replacing them.
The season finished with a 3-3 draw at home to Villa. The team finished 6th. It doesn't feel like the worst platform for Colin to have built on, but Preno, as we move into that following season, Colin only got 13 games, and you mentioned at the start of the pod, it was a mixed bag in that final summer of transfers. Is that where it went wrong ultimately?
100%, yeah. So the quality of players coming in just wasn't anything like the quality of players that they were replacing, and even the players that looked, ostensibly decent. I'm thinking of so Pat Nevin. Tony Cottee started like a house on fire, but then, fell away, quite badly and was dropped, I think, about 2 or 3 months after he'd signed. Neil McDonald, he was okay. He was actually player of the season, I think, 88, 89. The Echo Man of the Match awards that we dished out. But they just weren't anything like the quality of player that they were seeking to replace. And that was why we suddenly started slipping down the table from being the absolute best team in the country and in Europe by some way. We weren't quite reaching those marks, and Arsenal was stealing a march on us. So Liverpool won the league in 1990. We couldn't quite replicate what we'd gone before, and we were starting to slide, ever so perceptibly. First it was 4th, then it was 6th. The cup runs were ending, in quarterfinals or, Zenith Data Systems Cup finals or whatever. It wasn't quite, the level that we'd been used to, and we couldn't quite seem to get it right. And the start of that season, 91, 92, was a horrible start to the season. I think it was the one where Neville staged his famous sit-in on the goalpost against Leeds because he was getting frustrated. I think he got frustrated at the results and had tried to get out a few times. He put in transfer requests and Colin just backheeled them, out of hand. You're not going anywhere. I think he'd signed, it was like an 8-year contract or something. It was a ridiculously long contract because he was so good. And no one even knew what he'd done that day. I mean, we were 2-0 down at home to Leeds, or 3-0 down at home to Leeds, who'd just been promoted. A Leeds team that would go on to win the league in 1992. So they were a decent Leeds team, but no one really appreciated that. They just saw a side that had just come up. 3-0 frustrated. And Neville got so irritated in the dressing room at half time. He just wanted to go and clear his head, he said. In true Neville tradition, he said the only place he could think of to go and clear his head is to sit down in front of 40,000 people. So he did. He marched out, sat and leant against the goalpost. And that was just Neville being Neville. I'm sure he did it to make a bit of a point, to make people aware of his frustration, even though he claimed he just wanted to clear his head. But poor Colin didn't know anything about it. It was only after the game when the press said, "What do you make of your goalkeeper's behaviour? What are you talking about?" And he had to actually ring him, so the following morning, say what was going on there. So the season started badly, and then it just never picked up. I think we lost, the first 3 games last season, drew a few games, so just couldn't get any kind of run going. And it was probably a mercy sacking, if you like, so when Colin finally lost his job, it's quite early on. I think it was like late September, early October.
13 games in, yeah.
Yeah, it was, so and I think it had been coming, the pressure was building. And then, so the media were beginning to speculate about his future, so quite significantly. And, but we'll come on to it then. But, so when Howard, did return, the sense of elation amongst Evertonians, I think, was huge at the time. But we'll get on to that. I mean, so how do you think that season started, Gav? It was grim, wasn't it?
That Leeds game, it was shocking. We get beat 3-0 at half time, ended up getting back to 3-2. I thought Nev was out of order, to be honest with you, and so did the supporters. I think there was I think we played Arsenal in the following home game. I think there was a banner in the Gladysy Centre that said "Once a bin man, always a bin man." Yeah. So there was a lot of sort of aggression on and off, within the club. I think there's a lot of I think if you speak to some of the players or you read their accounts, there's a lot. There was a lot of bit of mistrust going on amongst the squad about motives and things like that. We had old players, younger players, and I think there was also Colin had started to, as managers do when he panicked, started to toughen up the team. And on the pitch we weren't pretty to watch either, so it wasn't a place playing great football and being unlucky. We were not playing like we would expect an Everton team to play, and we were just sliding into the abyss quite quickly. And so we got to. I think we went to. It was a Sheffield United, Bill, wasn't it, in the League Cup at the end of October? And in the days when a League Cup game was hugely significant to a manager's future, and we all know what happened. But yeah, with Preno at that, it was just a dreadful period. And I think we were 18th or something like that, which for a club of Everton stature, where we've been top 6 for the best part of the previous decade, or 6th or 7th, that's not a great place to be.
Just as a bit of a context for listeners again who perhaps didn't live through the period, finances is such a big part of football now, and it establishes and re-establishes the elites, etc. Had there been a shift in the teams with money at the turn of the decade? Were Arsenal and Leeds, teams that you've mentioned, were they suddenly flush with cash and able to attract the better players that maybe once we had been able to?
Yeah, I don't know about them being flush with cash, but certainly there being a big shift at Everton. And I don't really know quite why that was, so whether we never really cashed in properly on the success that we'd had at the end of the 80s. Because being a club that in the summer of 1988 had spent an absolute fortune, 2.2 million, a British record on Tony Cottee, as well as 900 grand on Pat Nevin and $500,000 on Neil MacDonald and another $1 million on Stuart McCall, to like 1990, 1991, where we were still spending money, but we were having to, watch the pennies a little bit more. There being shifts at boardroom level, so we need to reference as well. I think John Moores was very, very old by this stage and was like ceasing to have, any kind of meaningful influence on the football club. And I think Dr. David Marsh had come in as chairman round about then. And for a lovely fellow though he is, so he wasn't really, a switched on football chairman. I mean, I know towards the end of that decade, he was collared by, some of the press lads, trying to basically, what's going on at Everton Football Club? And it was almost like a rabbit in the headlights. He didn't know, quite, how to deal with them and how to answer them. So Sir Philip, was still around, but again, his influence didn't seem to be, quite the same. So no, the club seemed to be on a downward slide, so on and off the pitch at the start of the decade.
Yeah, I think going back to your question, Phil, we touched on this last podcast, English football by 1990 was a completely different beast on the pitch to what it was in 85 when you only had Liverpool to beat. In the late 80s, you had Arsenal under George Graham. Ferguson was beginning to make his presence felt. He's won the cup, hadn't he, in 90. You had Leeds coming back up, who were good enough to win the title. Within 12 months, you got Jack Walker plunging all his millions, haven't you, into Blackburn. So you've got, and obviously you've got Liverpool, who are still on the slide, but still obviously good enough to win the title in 90. So the world of English football was completely different when Colin was under pressure at the end of 90 to what it was, say, when Howard was under pressure in 1983. And I think we need to see that in context. And financially, you are right, because this was the time when the Premier League was going to be, this when we were one of the big five to form the Premier League. So although we may not be cash rich, we were still one of the big players in English football. We were pushing for the for the changes in the game, which, I mean, that period where we are in football now all comes from this period we're talking about here, 1990, 91. So we were struggling at a time of great change within English football. And money, you are right, was coming into the game. We'd had Michael Knight trying to take over Man United, hadn't we?
Of course,
so, all of a sudden, I would like to say this, that never spoke about finances ever previously, but finances are now always spoken at board level, every board meet, So I think Colin's problem in 90, and let's face it, this may be a familiar tale, is he'd spent too much money, not got it back in sales, and was now struggling to balance the books. And he had players on big wages who he couldn't get rid of, which, I've never heard that story ever with Everton, yeah. But I think that was I think that's one of the reasons he was struggling financially, because that's when it was, Preno. You had you make money, didn't you, in football, gate money, and any profits on transfers.
Yeah.
And if you spent a fortune in transfers, then you as you say, and I think Littlewood's influence wasn't as great then financially, and so the club was always going to be struggling.
Well, the one player that underlines, so that argument entirely was very early part of the decade, Maurice Johnston, who was signed for $1.5 million in 1991. And it was quite an exciting signing. It was a typical Howard Kendall signing in that he was a lively character on and off the pitch. And he hoped that he would bring that same kind of charisma and personality that Andy Gray had brought, a little bit of devil about him, so rub off on other players. And he was a decent player. He scored an average of about 1 in 3, I think, 1 in 4 during his Everton career, but he never really had the impact that Howard had hoped. Ultimately so that in the summer of 1993, he had to let him go on a free transfer. And that was like a player who, like, $1.5 million was a decent sum of money back then. And to let him go for nothing to Hearts only 2 years later underlined the folly really of our transfer recruitment at that time.
So when that just to finish off on that point, when we're looking at Everton in this period, Phil, certainly 1992, his finances are a big part of it. We had limited amounts of money to spend because Colin had spent so much for very little reward over 2 or 3 years,
I was looking at the incomings and outgoings of that, I think summer of 1991, and it almost is like a changing of the guard. I mean, the players that left in that calendar year are some of the greatest names in the club's history. So Kevin Sheedy, Graham Sharp, then Stuart McCall, who was one of the signings that Colin had bought, hadn't been successful. He went. Peter Beagrie went. Pat Nevin, who'd only been signed a few years previously, went on loan to Tranmere. Mike Milligan, who Colin had signed and Howard just didn't fancy at all, was bombed out straight away. They all left. And the incomings weren't bad. I mean, Peter Beardsley was signed in the summer of 1991. That was inspirational. Beardsley was magnificent for 2 seasons. And again, Howard let him go far too soon. Mark Ward was signed. Mark Ward was a decent signing. And I know we're going to move on towards, the germination of the Joe Royle FA Cup team. Matt Jackson was signed, a young kid from Luton Town, who, so no one knew anything about, but, quite a big reputation. And then Maurice Johnston and Gary Ablett. Gary Ablett was another, inspired signing. So it was a significant shift. The old guard were definitely being moved away, and we're getting new faces coming in all the time. But the argument still persists. Those new faces weren't quite at the level of your Kevin Sheedy or your Graham Sharps.
Absolutely not. So Colin's under pressure, isn't he, when he goes to Sheffield United, and we get beat up with 2-1 midweek game of a Wednesday, and then I think he got the bullet on the night. I think he knew the game was up by then.
It was early mornings. I remember Ken Rogers at the Echo. So we were talking to him. What's happening today? And he says, "Look, I'm going to go down and see Colin, but so I need to ask him if he's going to resign because he thought things were so so bad at that time." Anyway, by the time he'd got down to Belfield, he had actually been sacked. So
yeah, and I think that those. Phil, obviously we've been Jim Roy Blue. We must have changed 4 or 5 managers in the last 5 years. Those were the days when, if Everton changed the manager, it was a massive event. I mean, we were never a club. I mean, we always give managers time. We were never a club. We would change a manager every 12 months, 2 years. Yeah. We always give managers. So for Colin, especially given his his relationship with Everton, his reputation, it was a massive thing. Even though it was expected in some respects, it's still a massive thing to sack an Everton manager then. Massive story.
Yeah. Interesting how we went through the the stability of Moyes, and then we've come back to that period, haven't we? But as Preno said, Jimmy Gabriel took 1 game in charge, won 3-0. Everything's
Park Rangers, remember it well. Yeah, I remember Jimmy actually taking over that game and sitting behind the desk at Belfield and going, "Oh my God, this is like being in charge of Battlestar Galactica." But he did well. He won his only game 3-0. So,
yeah. And then Preno, I'll stay with you, mate, because as you said, and I think you alluded to it, but my question was obviously, what was the reaction?
Elation, genuine elation, because Howard had come back from Spain to Manchester City and done a really good job at Manchester City. They'd been, struggling against relegation, and he turned them round. They were going in the right direction. I remember it so clearly. It's one of those "where were you" moments. And there used to be a post office in the middle of town, in the Whitechapel near that area. And I was actually in that post office, so when I heard somebody say, "Oh my God, just did on the radio, pre-internet, pre-Wi-Fi, all that. Howard Kendall's come back. So I was in the back of a huge queue. I don't know what I was doing there. I just left and legged it straight back to the office. It was absolutely thrilling news. And at the time, we had a news editor at the Daily Post called Simon Reynolds, who was an absolutely diehard Manchester City fan. And he was mortified. He actually wanted to go down to Goodison Park and kill Howard Kendall. You know, he was talking about, you know, sort of going down there and campaigning and protesting because he'd done such a great job at City. But, you know, he came out with that famous quote at the time, you know, yeah, it was a love affair with Man City, but I'm married to Everton. With Everton, it's a marriage. And that was Howard to a T. Cute little, you know, sort of phrase for the media. But equally, a manager who'd achieved incredible things with us only, you know, sort of 3 or 4 years previously. So we were absolutely thrilled to see him come back, thrilled. And then obviously Colin was appointed as number 2 again, you know, so the old guard that had been in place only a couple of years previously, back in place again. But
yeah, I remember where I was. Well, actually, I found out the complete old-fashioned way on CFAX. Yeah, I come in from where, stuck the telly on, and there's just Howard Kendall returned to Everton, and I literally, you know, open-mouthed, but like you, elated.
Yeah.
With Colin coming back as well. I mean, Colin was the surprise one. I mean, because what you've got to remember, I mean, Howard wasn't necessarily the first choice. I think the first choice was Ron Atkinson, wasn't he? And Ron was the first choice, and he wouldn't leave Sheffield Wednesday. Yeah. And then the opinion was that Joe was going to be the manager. Yeah. And I think if you'd have put odds on the 6th of November 1990, whatever it was, the 5th of November, I can't exactly. He was going to walk into the Everton boardroom as manager tonight. I think you would have put all your money on Joe Royle, and then Howard turns up. But Howard said, didn't he, Phil, this is like, going back to your point, it was a different club then, and Preno alluded to it. You know, the boardroom was different. The club had always operated, hadn't it, in the successful years. The great triumvirate of Phil Carter, Howard. And somebody you mentioned last week, Preno, or last podcast, who doesn't get enough credit, Jim Greenwood, who's the club secretary. Yeah. And basically, you know, they ran the club between them. And so if Howard wants anything to do it, Jim had always sorted out for him. So, as you say, what the boardroom did then, because like Desmond Pitcher was there and like David Marsh's, I think it was a bit more bureaucracy at boardroom level, wasn't it? Where in the past I would have just been used to run the club with their Jim and Philip. To get things done took a lot more people, you know, to decide on things. And I think that Howard noticed that straight away. It wasn't the same boardroom that he was coming into, what he left in '87.
Well, he found that out Jim, 2 years later, but we'll get on to that.
Yeah. And Jim, you know, that's where we're coming to, isn't it? Jim was a great man. Jim, and with all due respect to the people who went before him and afterwards, he doesn't get enough credit. He sadly passed away a few years ago, didn't he? Well, he's easily the best administrator I've ever had in terms of getting things done, you know. And he was fantastic. And I think what happened was as well, his power diminished because the board had changed, and Howard was always operating within those restrictions. I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it? Phil, we're talking about money. He tried to sign Ian Rush, didn't he, Howard?
Yeah.
He tried to sign Ian Rush. He had talked to Ian Rush, and he tried to sign George Yadzi, didn't he? I think he was at Real Madrid, but it was too much money.
Yeah.
He actually went over to Spain with Jim Greenwood to sign him, which would have been a great George Yadzi playing for Everton, you know. So the game had changed. Howard had changed as well, and that was the thing, wasn't it? Which he never realised is Howard and Colin the first time was like a, you know, straightforward relationship. But when they come back, Howard had been managing away, Colin had been manager. So the dressing room dynamics are different, aren't they? Colin's the coach with players who's previously managed. You know, which is a strange thing, isn't it, in the dressing room, which was already had its problems.
Yeah. Preno, you spoke about Howard's return and that he'd done an excellent job at City. Was there any sense that he'd changed as a manager? The situation changed around him, and as Gav says, he'd walked into a different football club with different dynamics. Had Howard changed at all? Had Bilbao altered his perception of management, or did he just kind of walk back into Everton and have to adapt to a different way of doing things?
Well, I don't think he changed, but I think, as Gavin mentioned earlier, you know, the landscape of English football had changed quite significantly. And he was still the same manager. He still had the same approach to the game. He tried to, as he always did at a football club, he always said, Howard, when he came into a club, he tried to assert his authority immediately by making an example of somebody, by, sort of pulling up a player and just making, them aware of who was in charge. And I think poor old Mike Milligan was the player that, so he decided was going to be the one he would assert that authority on. And he didn't fancy him as a player. And he'd actually told the press, one afternoon, he says, yeah, we'll be looking to move Mike Milligan on. And some of the press lads said to him, well, what if he doesn't want to leave? And he goes, don't worry, lads. When he's playing at Morecambe on a Friday night in the A-team, he'll want to leave. And he did. And I think that might have been a famous game because Tony Cottee had been dropped as well. Another player that Howard wasn't sure about. And Tony Cottee played in that game in the A-team on a Friday night at Morecambe. And I think John Keith of the Express was very friendly with Tony Cottee, and he had a chat with him, and he revealed to him that, oh yeah, God, it was a real come down for me. I was actually playing against my milkman, and it was milkman. And so John used that. It was a lovely line, used it in the paper. Anyway, Howard saw it, and he thought it was Tony belittling, so some of the players that he was playing with by, sort of using a story like that. And so he fined him. He did, one of his famous Chinese, sort of meal get-togethers, which Tony Cottee had to foot the bill for. So yeah, he came in to a lot of players that he wasn't immediately, sort of happy with. He wanted to try and make changes as quickly as possible. And Howard was like that. He was a great wheeler dealer in the transfer market. He loved, sort of bringing in players, moving players on. But they never really quite worked out. He did buy some very, very successful players, but equally, some of the other players he brought in weren't quite as successful. And maybe that little magic touch in the transfer market wasn't quite there that he'd had, so in the mid-80s.
I think the transfer, sorry, Phil, I think the transfer market had changed as well. So Howard was able to buy Derek Mountfield from Tranmere, wasn't he, in 82, wasn't he? Or Kevin Sheedy from Liverpool reserves. In 91, you couldn't do that. That type of market had changed. So those players weren't available anymore. And when you were struggling, that was a problem. I mean, I always remember the one, he tried to sign Dean Saunders, didn't he?
Oh, I'll tell you a story about that when you're finished.
Yeah. Well, this is where sometimes, where the magic leaves you as a manager. Yeah. It's a bit like Harry Katzik was a different manager in the early 70s, the early 60s, 10 years of manager. I always talk about this, 10 years at the top. Yeah. Howard in 91, he was so sure he was going to get Dean Saunders. He sold Graham Sharp, didn't he? Yeah. The problem was, Dean Saunders went to Liverpool, and then he's thinking, I've left myself a problem here, because I'm now centre forward short, and I've got to look for somebody. Okay, he got Beardsley, but Beardsley wasn't a replacement for Graham Sharp, was he? Then that left him another problem. And so the team, I always felt lacked balance in the early 90s. And, and one of those reasons was that the transfer market Howard faced was completely different to what I'd been in 81.
I mean, an indication of that, Howard was so convinced he was going to sign Dean Saunders because Graham Souness was in charge at Liverpool, and Howard was aware that they wanted Mark Wright from Derby County, and Howard wanted Dean Saunders. And so, both players, Howard also fancied Mark Wright, Graham Souness also fancied Dean Saunders. And so they came to an agreement, him and Graham, where they said that, okay, so we'll go for Saunders, you go for Mark Wright. And so they did, until Graham Souness got wind of the fact that Dean Saunders also quite fancied coming to Liverpool rather than Everton. So Everton were away on pre-season tour. I think they were in Germany somewhere, and Ken Rodgers was with them. And they were so confident Dean Saunders was signing. His name was printed on a team sheet for the pre-season friendly. Everton were playing later that day. And so that's out there somewhere. That'll be a great bit of memorabilia for a collector to get hold of. So it was only when Ken had rung the office and they said, oh, no, Saunders is here. He's actually signing for Liverpool. He's what? He's signing for Liverpool. Oh, my God. So he goes and tells Howard. Howard goes ballistic. Ken's in his hotel room. You sit there. You're going to hear what I say to that. And I won't use the language on this, but, how he described Dean Saunders, it wasn't complimentary. You're going to hear what I say to him. And so he tries to ring Dean Saunders, who quite sensibly didn't pick up his phone. And Howard's getting angrier and angrier. And in the end, Ken's like, don't worry, Howard, don't worry. So I accept that you had an agreement and that, so he's turned his back on it and he's reneged on him. But it was, so Saunders quite fancied turning for Liverpool.
I think what balanced the scales of Saunders' dad that played for Liverpool, hadn't he? Yeah. The 50s, so there's an emotional thing there, but that was just a little bit of bad planning. Yeah. I think he may have kept Sharpie for another year. I don't know whether Graham wanted to go. He could have kept Sharpie another year. I mean, Yeah, it was just signing different players, and you just felt that even after 12 months of Howard, you're thinking, I'm not so not so sure now.
No, it was weird. Well, you talk about the balance. If you remember, we had the two, what they call the midget gems up front, Peter Beardsley and Maurice Johnston. I mean, Joe Johnston wasn't that small, but, so they were a small, mobile, forward line in the days when English football still pretty much relied on a target man playing off, a smaller striker. Leeds won the title with Lee Chapman, leading the line. Arsenal had Alan Smith, so all of the top sides had a target man. Everton didn't. And in the end, so Howard was so desperate, he tried to buy Duncan Ferguson, from Dundee, and that didn't quite work off. He ended up going to Rangers, and so we ended up in the end going for what he, thought were, the next best thing, which was Paul Rideout. It was an underwhelming signing at the time. A lot of the fans were like, "Oh, we're being linked with Duncan Ferguson," and we've ended up signing, Rideout. Rideout turned out to be a very, very good signing for the football club, but it was only $500,000 at the time, and people were a little bit underwhelmed. But the balance was completely wrong all over the school.
Yeah, as you say, that that first season of Howard being back, finished 9th, trip to Wembley, of course. But in terms of the context of building, building the team that ultimately would start at Wembley in '95, you said Rideout came in '92, Hinchcliffe had already arrived, Matt Jackson had come, and of the debuts for Unzi, he would start to play in the first team. Barry Horn would be signed as well, so it's kind of a strange period in the sense that the team as a whole, and as you've said, both of you, lacked balance. Ultimately, the foundations were being laid in a strange way for a team that would go and win the FA Cup at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, we need to mention Bob the Pole as well, Robert Varsic, of what a great signing that was initially, that never quite, ran its course. He came in and everyone was just blown away because his introduction to the team was magnificent. It's like we signed George Best. He just suddenly started, dominating games, and everyone's thinking, wow, who is this player? And for very similar to how Jelavic was years later, hit the ground running for, 2 or 3 months and looked like a world beater, and then just disappeared without trace, just couldn't get any kind of consistency going. And it was really, really sad, so that never worked out. But the players, Matt Jackson was a young kid who was brought in, and what he lacked defensively, because he wasn't great as a defender, but he was very, very good going forward. And, so that was one of the cornerstones. Unzi, he came on, towards the tail end of a game at Tottenham and leathered one in at the far post, scored on his debut. But that was a fleeting, appearance. He never really came through properly until that 94-95 season. And Barry Horn was very similar to Paul Rideout in one of those slightly underwhelming signings that he'd been around various football clubs, a bit of a journeyman player, if you like. I think, so fans were hoping for a sexier signing. As it was, Barry was great for the football club, so a very, very much underrated player in his time.
Yeah, I think, sorry, Phil, just another point to that is, I think one of Howard's problems as well is players had changed, and the way you... Can you see me?
You can see it and hear you.
yeah. But I said my best bit there, and it wasn't even on camera. Players had changed. So Howard's management methods that worked in the early to mid-80s were not going to work 10 years later. Players had more power. They had more money for the stars. We all know that early 90s, that's when, fitness regimes were far more stricter. Diets were far more, healthier. So Howard's style of management that had worked at Everton in his first 5 years were no longer going to work 10 years later. I mean, that's what they always say about Liverpool, isn't it? That Souness, that he tried to change things at Liverpool because he'd been abroad, and this was the way forward for English football, and that's what all the clubs were doing. They were successful with using new methods of training and diet and stuff. And I'm not sure whether that was necessarily Howard's main strength as a manager. So in some respects, by the early 90s, his methods were probably a little bit out of date. Yeah. As well as maybe as well as having players who were nowhere near as good as they were in the early 80s. And the other thing as well is he had a good crop of youngsters in the early 80s that came through the reserve team. We had no youngsters that came through Preno did in the early 90s, really, apart from maybe one or two.
Well, John Ebrell was the one that everybody attached such huge hopes towards because he'd come through the English soccer school at Lilleshall, which was this fabled, sort of academy of like the greatest footballers in the world. And because he'd been an academy graduate of that, people expected something, I don't know, something slightly different to what John was. John was a very good midfielder, but he wasn't a goal scorer. He wasn't somebody that would dribble past the player 2 or 3 times and, so leather one in. And so people always felt that, they'd expected a bit more really on what they were actually receiving. Similar to when we signed John Collins in the Walter Smith era, so people thought he was a different player to what we actually got. Decent enough player in what he did, but people just wanted that something a bit different. So yeah, you're right. There weren't many, so young.
And Everton come through in the late 80s, wasn't it? But in this period, we're talking about 90 to 93. Yeah. 80 to 83, we had 6 or 7 players who came through from the way, from the reserve team. We were all really good players who won trophies for us. In the early 90s, we didn't. We had nobody. All the good players in the early 90s, all the good young players went to Liverpool rather than Everton, as we well know now. And I don't know if you're being Everton fans.
Yeah.
So that was the other problem we faced as a club. We were massively in debt. I think 3 or 4 million, if I remember. 3 or 4 million in debt, and I think that's why we ended up selling Keown, wasn't it?
Yeah.
To balance the books. So not only has Howard got problems on the pitch in terms of rebuilds, and the club has got serious financial problems off the pitch. 3 or 4 million doesn't sound a lot, but then it was a massive amount of money.
Yeah.
And those in gate years, Preno, what we getting? 92, 93 average gate, 20,000, something like that.
Well, that was the era just before the Premier League when everybody, was suffering like that. And it sounds like, so average gates of what, 20,000? But that was exactly what everybody were getting, so around the Premier League or being around the old First Division as was. The Premier League, the advent of the Premier League in 92, 93 did improve things significantly. The game changed massively, but equally it became more of a commodity. It became more of something you could sell, and the makeup of football, supporters were getting quite, so social, talking about the social change of supporters then. But from being a predominantly, so young male working class sport, so which it had been throughout the 80s, maybe the Premier League era, you started getting a broader spectrum. You started getting more families. It became more of a middle class sport. You started getting more women going to games, and it did change, so quite significantly. And as a result, attendances started to rise, and so people started to get richer as a result.
On the back of the sale of the Premier League, but it is important. The other actual point to consider, Phil, as well, is the Taylor report in 1990 about clubs having to have all-seater stadiums meant that clubs had to spend a lot of money on refurbishing grounds, and that was also a big point.
Yes, good point. Well, let's just a quick recap then. So 1991 finished 9th, 91, 92. 92, 93, 13th.
Yeah.
So if we head into what would be 93, 94, did we sense that it would be that Howard was on borrowed time in that respect, that he was under pressure? What was the feeling?
No, I was, this is my first full season as the Everton correspondent at the Echo, and I remember it very, very well. I'd taken over in the March the previous season when we got beat away at Villa, and were far too close to relegation for comfort, and so eventually stayed up, well, only by 3 or 4 points. So it wasn't, you say 13th, but there wasn't a massive gap between us and the teams that went down. So we needed to make a good start the following season, and I always got the impression that it was Howard holding it together. I remember at the time, rightly or wrongly, I was placing all the pressure on the board, so for not generating the funds that so that Howard needed. We won the first 3 games in 93, 94 and made a decent start to the season, but then lost the next 3. And then, we drew 1, then beat Liverpool, I think, beat them 2-0. And so it was a real up and down season. But I always got the impression that Howard was the one all together until that fateful day in December against Southampton. So when, I don't know if you want to jump ahead to that, but so the way in which he left the football club, because we played Manchester United on the Wednesday in the League Cup, got beat 2-0, but we were desperate for a target man, for a striker. And Howard had spoken to Alex Ferguson, and Dion Dublin was a centre forward in the United squad who broke his leg very early when he signed for United, and so couldn't quite get his way back into the team. And Howard inquired about the possibility of signing him, And Ferguson said, yeah, I think we can let him go, but put a premium on it rather than the $1 million they'd bought him for. I think he wanted $1.5 million for him. So Howard went to the board and said, look, we've got a deal here, so we can get Dion Dublin for $1.5 million. He knew that the money was there, the money was available, but the board wouldn't let him spend it. Now, whether they were questioning his judgment or whether they just thought, so Alex Ferguson was trying to pull a fast one and hold Everton to ransom because they were so desperate for a striker, and so pay $500,000 over the odds. For whatever reason, they refused to let Howard spend that money. Now, Howard, you could argue, was being quite cute. He'd seen the writing on the wall, realised there was no way he could possibly, turn things around. So took that as an excuse to leave. I don't know. Or maybe he just genuinely felt that his authority had been undermined. But we beat Southampton 1-0. Tony Cottee scored. 13,000 was the gate that day. And he gave his post-match press conference, went downstairs. Everyone thought no more of it. Next thing, he emerges again half an hour later, and all the national media lads had all gathered in a little pack as they were, discussing what lines they were going to use for their pieces. And Colin Wood from the Mail spotted him first and goes, "Oh, hello, Howard." And he goes, "Got something to say." And Colin, "Say it outside, Howard. Don't want the Sunday papers to hear." And Howard was like, "No, I'm sorry. This is important." And we all thought, wow, what's going on here? So he came in and just basically said that, "I take it you've not been impressed with what you've had to see here today, gentlemen, but I'll be all right. So I'm resigning as manager of Everton Football Club." I was like, "What?" And that was it. We resigned, went downstairs. So everyone's like running around like scalded cats then. We couldn't quite find out what had, sort of gone on. Anyway, it ultimately came out over the weekend. It was the Dion Dublin issue. And the club was in turmoil. So the manager had gone. None of the players seemed to know quite why or what had happened. The board weren't making any statements, so to the effect as to why he'd gone. It was a real mess, to be honest.
What was the reaction, Gav? Preno said there had been elation when he returned.
Yeah.
And you'd spoken about, being agog, seeing it on CFAX. What was the reaction of him quitting?
Massive. Couple of reflections on that first half of that season. We won our first 3 games, Preno. Well, the first home game of the season, Howard said in his programme notes, "I think we'll surprise a few people this season." He wasn't joking, was he? Yeah. But I remember we won our first 3 games. We were top of the table. Where I found out where we were top of the table? I was in Barbados.
Oh dear.
But yeah, I remember the Dublin thing. Yeah, Preno was right there. I think what it was, and the director's gone to see him play. And I think he'd had a broken leg, hadn't he, the previous year, playing for Man United. And I think I said to him that we think he's got a limp. Right. So we're going to prove it. And Howard thought, well, hang on a minute, I've got directors now telling me about football players' injuries and abilities and stuff. And I think, I fully get where he's coming from. There was an interesting, don't know if you heard it, Colin in an interview last year said he'd heard that Howard may have been getting the bullet anyway, which was quite interesting. But Howard went before him, which is quite an interesting, which I don't think came out at the time. Which I thought was fascinating because there'd been even though we were really struggling, we were at 13th or so, we weren't massively like.
We were 13th when Howard went.
Yeah, we weren't, but there'd been no word of Howard being under pressure. And I think there was an acknowledgement that he was working under a lot of financial constraints, certainly. Yeah. But Colin to say that, who obviously would have had a lot of inside knowledge, I thought, well, that was a bit of a revelation, because that certainly wasn't the impression that I got at the time that Howard was.
Well, I didn't. Not in the slightest. And equally, if that was the case, you'd imagine that they would have had somebody lined up, more quickly than they did.
Yeah, absolutely.
We had that appalling spell when Howard had gone, when the club was in limbo, and no one seemed to know. Jimmy Gabriel took over again, and obviously, in charge of Battlestar Galactica again, and he was here heading straight for the bloody asteroids with this one, because I think we lost 6 of the next 7 games. We drew 0-0 at Sheffield United, I think it was. Then we lost 6 of 7, didn't score in any of them until we'd got to Chelsea, where we got beat 4-2, managed to score 2 goals on that occasion. And I always remember, so Bill Kenwright was doing Radio Merseyside that day, and fans, so London fans shouting into the press box, "Why do you support this lot, Bill? What's going on? Why do you follow this lot?" And Bill being Bill, "Because I love them, because I love them." Well, so he didn't have anything like the influence, so in the boardroom that he would later have. And, they had nobody lined up. And, in the end, we all know which direction they turned in. And we know why they turned in that direction. But it was absolutely, bizarre decision. Mike Walker was the guy that they identified to come in on the basis, purely and simply, that Norwich had won 5-1 at Goodison Park earlier in the season, when Efeni Koku had an absolute, sort of best day of his life, scored 4 goals, and so won 5-1. That was when Howard actually had Brett Angel on loan, and took one look and said, "No, not for us." So let Brett go back to Southend. In fact, he lost his contact lenses in the game that day and was scrabbling around in the pitch looking for them. People were wondering what he's doing. No one knew he wore contact lenses. But anyway, Norwich, won 5-1 that day. And the previous season, they'd ran Manchester United close for the league. Now, I say ran them close. They finished second by conceding more goals than they scored. They were so up and down. But as a result, qualified for the UEFA Cup. Famously, 1-2-1 at Bayern Munich. Went to the Olympic Stadium, beat Bayern Munich 2-1. Got beat 1 then in the second leg. But, went through on the away goals. And so that caused a huge stir in English football. Wow, little Norwich, sort of beat Bayern Munich away. They got knocked out in the very next round by Inter Milan, but no one seemed to think about that. It was just like, oh yeah, there must be, this incredible tactical genius, Mike Walker, who was overseeing this victory over Bayern Munich. It was a very naive way of thinking. And if you looked into it any, more close than that, you'd have realised that his credentials didn't really stack up. But because they played an easy on the eye brand of football, and because he'd beaten Bayern Munich, he was the guy that Everton turned to.
Yeah, I mean, I think I know we're losing at that point there is the other thing, 1994 around this time. This when we had John Moser died, hadn't he, in September, hasn't it, something like that. So we've got sort of a vacuum at boardroom level now, haven't we?
Yeah.
Which was always going to be difficult to manage under. So that was interesting.
I mean, Preno, you were doing the reporter's job at the time. What were your first impressions of Mike Walker?
I'll choose my words carefully here. He was having himself. I think that's one thing to say. I mean, he turned up immaculately presented. Insisted on having the initials MW painted on the car parking space in the car park, which Mark Ward just took as a challenge straight away. His initials are obviously MW. He's going to park there as well. So I went down, and obviously we had the situation in place there whereby we would speak to the manager every single day, and it was something that Ken Rodgers had started with Howard, and it was great. So we were privileged, and I accept that. So we'd go down, we would spend 10 or 20 minutes chatting to the manager, go back to the office and write the story. And Mike Walker was happy to continue with that arrangement, which I was delighted with. But whilst you were talking to him, you got the impression that he didn't really quite have any kind of, sort of plan in place. And if you talked to him long enough, he ended up contradicting what he'd ended up, starting to tell you about. He wanted this very easy on the eye brand of football. I think Vinny Samways was one of his first signings. He brought Brett Angel in. And again, to me, that indicates, you talk about a boardroom vacuum. You didn't quite know who was making the decisions at the time. Because now this may or may not be the case, but we were told at the time that Mike Walker had arrived and said to Jim Greenwood, the secretary, so I don't mind him, so I quite, like the look of him. If you get the opportunity, see what you can do. So Jim Greenwood did what Jim Greenwood did, went and bought him, so 500 grand. And I remember Ian Ross, who later went to work for Everton, was part of the national press back at the time. He was at Belfield, and they'd done their briefing with Mike Walker. They'd left, Ian had left, he jumped in his car, drove away. He turned the radio on, and the radio, Everton have just signed Brett Angel from Southend, 500 grand. So we thought the other press guys had done the dirty on him and not told him. So he goes driving back in again. What state of you lot, sort of hiding that from me? So, hiding what from me? They've signed Brett Angel. Well, we don't know about it. So they went and knocked on Mike Walker's door. He goes, excuse me, we just had a press briefing. You hadn't told us you signed Brett Angel. And Mike was taken unawares. So has that been finalised, has it? I genuinely think he didn't know that the club had actually gone ahead and signed him. So brought Brett Angel back to the club. That underlined, so the lack of clarity in thinking at the club and at boardroom level. And Mike was just out of his depth, I think. He loved the idea of, sort of managing a football club like Everton, but he never really had, sort of the full respect of the players. They were used to, sort of Howard and the way Howard would run the football club. And my first, we'll get onto it in a future podcast, I'm sure, but my first full pre-season on tour with Mike Walker, 94, 95. Oh my word. It was like going on holiday on a stag weekend. It was madness. So it was a really, really weird appointment. And from the start of that season, January, I think beat Swindon at home 6-2 in his first home game, league game. I think we got knocked out of the FA Cup by Bolton in his first home game as manager. But Swindon, they were the worst team the Premier League, I think, has ever seen. They conceded 100 goals that season. And we beat them 6-2. But for an hour, they were the best side. It was 2-2. And it was only when Andy Much got sent off that we suddenly got a stranglehold on the game. So I managed to win that one. Then beat Chelsea 4-2. Brett Angel scored his only goal. And that was a poor Chelsea team. But then slid like an absolute, sort of stone. And we just couldn't get any kind of pattern to our play, any kind of a stranglehold on games. It was a dreadful second half of that season, it really was, which is why I thought that Howard was the only thing holding it together. And once he'd gone, the club just imploded. It was a dreadful end to the season, and obviously ended in that infamous Wimbledon game.
Well, Gav, May the 7th, 1994, obviously a significant game in Everton's history for, in many ways, as Prentice says, the wrong reasons, but ultimately the right result. Could you believe that we'd gone into a final game of the season in that situation?
I could believe it. I haven't seen us since January. We were just dreadful. I mean, we got beat. We won a crucial game, I think, at West Ham. We won 1-0. Tony Cottee scored, and then we got beat on a QPR. And then we got beat, you remember, it was 3-0 at Leeds the last week.
So,
Gav, I think we've lost you there, mate.
Yeah, I can't hear you. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
That's better, yeah. That's better, yeah.
Sorry
about that. I note to self, always charge your phone before you do a podcast.
Right.
Yeah. You hear me now, yeah?
Yes, yeah.
You're fine now, yeah, go on.
Edit this out, Phil. Going back to your question, Phil, yeah, I could believe it after the January. It was just hopeless. We've been poor for 4 or 5 months. We got beat 3-0 at Leeds, hadn't we? The last away game of the season, I think, and you just thought we're down here. There's 4 or 5 cups that would have gone down on the last day. I think there was Ipswich, Sheffield United, 1 or 2 others were all in the mix to go down, and Oldham with the other one, weren't they? But we're down there at the bottom because we deserve to be, because we've been poor since the opening sort of month of the season.
It was appalling. I mean, that end of the season, I remember Graham Stewart, who's now a club ambassador, had moved in just around the corner from me, and I became very friendly with Graham. And so I got a little insight into, sort of how things were going, the training ground and stuff. And I always remember this. He told me we were having a pint in the Grapes around the corner. And that was the season where we couldn't score penalties. I remember Tony Cottee had missed a couple, so it rotated a few times. And he said, so guess who's on pens? And I said, no idea. I went through the list. He goes, me. He says, I can see what's going to happen now. I'm going to have to score to keep us up, and my backside's going to be going. And, so when we got through to that Wimbledon game, that went through my head because it was a surreal period. I mean, as Gav says, we got battered at Leeds 3-0. Went to the final home game of the season, knowing that even if we won, we weren't definitely guaranteed safety. We needed to get results elsewhere also. And it was a horrendous atmosphere in the build-up to the game. We were getting phone calls at the Echo all week from people that desperately and genuinely needed psychological support. They thought that, so Everton were going to get relegated, and they were looking for us for reassurance, and we couldn't give it to them. It's not going to happen, is it? It's not going to happen. We're not going to go down. And we genuinely couldn't give them that support. And then everybody knows what happened. I mean, Ian Wright chose it as one of his games to remember on Match of the Day the other night, and it was great watching it again in hindsight. But the whole football world felt that way. This is Everton. Surely Everton can't go down. And if you remember, the night before the game, the Wimbledon team bus had been torched at the Lord Daresbury Hotel. The fans had gone down there, and it was to make a point, say, look, don't you dare turn up on that day and do what Wimbledon do, which is be the eternal party poopers. So that Wimbledon team coach was torched almost as a sign. That didn't bother Wimbledon. This was the Wimbledon, the crazy gang. They came, and I think John Fashioning was suspended, so he wasn't playing. But, otherwise it was the crazy gang. And, Anders had his little meltdown and, sort of handled the ball. Then we conceded that ridiculous own goal. And I always remember that plaintive scream from the girl coming from the Gladys Street as the ball's looping towards the net. And it was horrific. It was like silence apart from that scream. And you just thought, oh my God, we are going down here. And then obviously the penalty. And I say, when I saw, no one knew who was going to take it, because Wimbledon were disgusted by the award of the penalty because Anders so clearly dived over Peter Fear's challenge. Great dive, by the way. But, so the referee was hoodwinked, pointed to the spot. And Wimbledon was so annoyed, they booted the ball down the pitch. So Neville picked it up, and Neville started marching down the pitch, holding it. And we all thought, wow, Neville's going to take the penalty. And he would have done, because that was what Neville was like. And in the end, Diamond walked towards him and took the ball off him on the halfway line. And there was a smattering of applause around the ground from people like saying, wow, he's got the balls to take this. Because so you make no mistake, that is the most important penalty kick in Everton's history, bar none. He doesn't score that, we get relegated. Who knows where the club would be now? So puts the ball on the spot. And he only told me afterwards, the only one he'd taken previously was for Chelsea, and he'd skied it over the bar. So he'd never scored a penalty. Anyway, it was perfect. So Hans Seegers went one way, the ball went the other. We're back in the game. The roar was primeval. The park end was down, and they were rebuilding the park end stand, and you could just see fans hanging from the trees trying to get a vantage point. It was ridiculous. Second half, an hour gone, we're still relegated because the game was drifting and the results elsewhere weren't going our way. And it was really, really weird. I mean, Barry scored that goal out of nothing. It was an absolutely wonderful goal. Just leathered it in from 25 yards. That was the equaliser. That still wasn't enough either. We're still getting relegated. And it was only when, and everyone says, oh, Hans Seegers, sort of took a bung. Hans Seegers dived. He didn't. I think Graham was like going in for a block tackle on the edge of the penalty area. I don't think anybody anticipated the shot. It spun a little bit crazily, and Hans Seegers just misjudged it. It went in, and the scenes were absolutely ridiculous. And even then, at the end of the game, I'm waiting to file a report to the Football Echo to say that Everton are safe, and I didn't know that we were, because we'd lost sight of the fact that Sheffield United, they'd been getting beat 2-0 they were beating Chelsea 2-0, and we thought, oh, well, they're safe. We'd lost sight of them. I knew that Oldham was still a draw. Ipswich and Blackburn was still a draw. We thought, wow, so Everton's still a down. And I could see people celebrating and thinking, I can't file my copy now because I don't know. And it was Phil McNulty who was sat next to me who had a radio on, just started screaming, no, we're safe, we're safe. How? He goes, Sheffield United have lost, Chelsea have scored in the last minute. It was that close. And so I was able to bark a few paragraphs down the line and then just breathe out the biggest sigh of relief ever. It was a horrible afternoon that no one ever wanted to go through again. Unfortunately, we did 4 years later.
It was a strange afternoon, and Wimbledon were a good team as well. They finished sixth that season, and they weren't like the up and under team that they were in the 80s. They had some really good players playing for them then, didn't they? Yeah. But yeah, there's the game is infamous, obviously, because it was sort of brought up, wasn't it, later on in the year with the bung scandal when that broke in the late '94. That was. I remember listening to Radio 5 that night and said they were amazed that at no point on the first day when the bung scandal story broke was the Everton Wimbledon game mentioned once, and it's infamous for that. But yeah, I think you're right. I think that Stewart thing was just his third goal was just unexpected as a keeper. It was a clearance and he blocked it, and Seegers was always going to be maybe a yard too slow as a.
Think about his performance earlier in the game. Seegers made some very good stops prior to that.
He did.
If you're going to throw a game, you don't leave it till 12 minutes from the end. That's cutting it a bit close, I think, if you're sort of trying to throw a game.
It's always been in the contentious bit, hasn't it, that game? But yeah, we got lucky. I did, funny enough, I did speak to a Sheffield United player who got relegated that day. And they said they went to the airport the next day. And this is what they told me. He said they spoke to somebody involved from that game, and he said that game yesterday was fixed. Now I don't know whether that's true or not. It's just hard, but I find it strange. But it was the coach thing, wasn't it? That was the whole thing was surreal. It was a surreal couple of days, because I don't think Everton had been that. Be 50 odd years, won't it, since or 40 odd years since Everton had been in that position. We were playing away from home, wasn't it? In 51. I think it's probably the only time we've ever played at Goodison where we've needed the results at that stage to stay up, But it was surreal. And fair, I mean, Diamond, that took some bottle at, didn't it? To be fair, that penalty.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And it was just such a perfect penalty as well. So keeper went one way, tucked away just inside the post. It was horrible. It's just a really, really weird afternoon. And everyone always talks about, greatest atmospheres they've ever heard, etc., etc. And the Bayern Munich always comes into it quite rightly. The United game when Duncan Ferguson scored the diving header, Fiorentina. But for me, I genuinely think the noise that afternoon, and only 31,000 didn't exist. It was primeval, the noise that day. It meant so much to so many people. And people were just like absolutely in bits everywhere. It was horrible, absolutely horrible. And, but, an incredible, sort of denouement to it, if you like. Not something I ever wanted to experience again. And unfortunately, I did only 4 years later, which was equally as bad. But it's looked at now as being one of those, sort of great Premier League games because of the circumstances. But Everton should never have been in a position like that. And for a number of reasons they were, so from Howard going, from the boardroom upheaval, from like the players that are being brought in and allowed to go. Lots and lots of things went wrong with the football club in a period of 2 or 3.
Yeah.
Lessons weren't really learned.
I mean, there's a question to ask, isn't it? Whether Walker should have been given the bullet.
He should have been that summer, but having only given him the job in January, you couldn't have done that. You had to give him a closed season to bring in players, and he did. And that was where he brought in Vinny Samways, he brought in Daniel Amakachi. But again, this was because he had this idea in his head of this Everton team playing wonderful, free-flowing football, and yet he neglected the actual, sort of basis, the platform. He ended up having to play Barry Horn as a right wing back in one game. At home to Coventry because he didn't have, sort of sufficient defenders, sort of at the football club. Like I said, that pre-season was just all over the place. It was absolutely, sort of nightmarish to witness, so what was going on there. And the start of the season was appalling. And it was, and still is, the worst start to a season Everton had ever made in the club's history. Was it 7 points from the first 13 games? It was horrendous. How the hell? I mean, Joe Royle winning the FA Cup is, so will always be, so on his Everton scroll of honour. But keeping Everton in the Premier League should be higher than that because that was a miracle act, absolute miracle act to rescue the club from where they were.
Gav, no tears shed when in November Mike Walker was relieved of his duties.
No. I mean, we've been planning to do a piece on this couple of months ago, didn't we? And I was saying it was that bad at the start of the 94-95 season. Eamon Holmes was on national television, I think, one of these game shows or something. The oldest joke in the book, what's the difference between a triangle and Everton, and the feeling was he'd lost the dressing room, hadn't he, Benno? I tell you what, he brought Joe Park, didn't he, Mike?
Joe Parkinson and Anders Limpar on deadline day at the end of the 1994 season.
Ferguson was there on loan.
Yeah.
But by the time you get to November, I think he did a piece in the Echo saying why he should keep his job. I think he got 5 points in 3 games or something before he was getting the sack, and he was on borrowed time.
He was, but the crowd hadn't turned on him. The crowd was still quite supportive. They wanted him to succeed. And again, there'd been major boardroom upheaval again in the summer of 94 because Peter Johnson had gone head-to-head with Bill Kenwright in a bid to try and take over the football club. And Peter Johnson basically had more money. And so, so he ended up winning that battle. So he inherited a manager, so in Mike Walker, and gave him money to spend. But I suppose, so one of the few things we can be grateful to Peter Johnson for is that, so he, having inherited that manager, decided very, very quickly that he wasn't good enough and needed to be sacked. And the actual turning point was because Mike Walker was convinced he'd turn things around. We've got a streaky 1-0 win at home to West Ham. It was the streakiest win you've ever seen. Then went to Norwich, and it was the direst 0-0 draw you've ever seen. But because we kept back-to-back clean sheets, Mike Walker was right, that's it, we've got it cracked. But the board who watched the game that night went into the director's lounge at Carrow Road and said, oh my God, you know what the one common denominator is here? Mike Walker created both of those football teams, and they decided there and then that, so he had to go. And it was an international break as well. It was a fortnight break, so it gave them a little bit of breathing space. And so they took the decision to sack him. And then, so as you know, Big Joe was the man that they turned to. Yeah,
that was one fine night, that wasn't it, I think, the Norwich game. What I remember at the time is, Ben Howard had got the job in 90 and 93. There was quite a lot of contenders, for the job. Yeah. So when Walker got it, they were talking Joe Royle, Peter Reid, Steve Coppell. by the time you get to like 94, when Walker gets the bullet in November 94, the number of contenders was actually very small. I remember Ron Atkinson was linked again.
Yeah.
He's managing Aston Villa, and he just had the vote of confidence from the Villa board, you know. An ideal way to move clubs, you know. Yeah. And so you get to that point in the manager, and there's absolutely nobody apart from Joe that I think he could have appointed. And Joe maybe should have got the job in 90, probably. Yeah. Because I still think, by the way, going back to Howard should never have come back to Everton, but that's for a different podcast. But I think Joe was probably the only choice, if I recall, that we could have made that was probably made sense and could, you know, placate the fans, because there was a dearth of outstanding candidates, I think, for us then.
Yeah, very much so.
Okay, chaps. Well, we will leave it there, and we will pick up on the appointment of Joe Royle, his immediate impact, and then what came post Joe and for the remainder of the decade in the second part of the pod, which we will do next week. But thank you very much. That's been fascinating. Over an hour, I think we've been delving back into a rather miserable period of Everton's recent history anyway. But plenty to talk about, plenty in there that I didn't know, plenty I'm sure people are listening didn't know, players we missed out on, managers that maybe could have come and didn't, and loads of interesting backstory. So thank you very much again, and thank you very much for listening. This has been the Royal Blue Podcast.